think I'm kind of interested, first of all, in knowing why you were curious about Black Elk, and why you wanted to know more about him.
Yeah, well, I first encountered Black Elk in his famous prayer to the Great Spirit. It was actually in a song by Hawkwind called Black Elk Speaks, which was a recording. I don't think it was a Black Elk himself because he didn't speak English, but it was of I think a Lakota elder who was reciting the prayer. This was, I think, tied in with his earlier vision. And it's an amazing piece of poetry, really.
Mhm.
And it's something that is universal enough that someone of any faith could probably say amen to it. But it's also rooted in the specific images and figures of speech of the Lakota tradition. So I encountered him first through a prayer, which I actually incorporate into my daily prayers. So Black Elk sort of became part of my own spirituality. Later on, I read the book by Neihardt, which was sort of his. I mean, it's a complicated question of whether, how much of Black Elk Speaks is actually Black Elk and how much of it is Neihardt's overlay. But of course, Neihardt himself, like Black Elk, when he was young, he had he had an illness that led to a mystical experience. And so coming from, the perspective of a white settler, he had something in common with Black Elk. And so they collaborated on this.
Mhm.
And so it's more been just learning about where Black Elk Speaks came from. And then more recently, I only discovered about a year ago that a canonization process was going forward. It started, I think, in 2015 in the Diocese of Rapid City, which is in the kind of the home territory of Black Elk, and it was a cause to recognize him as a saint by the Lakota people, beginning with his family. And so I kind of was interested in this. I followed along how the process went. The way canonization goes is it's usually something that comes from the spirituality of a local community, and then it is sort of examined, investigated by kind of the universal church, and kind of gets the stamp of approval. Of course, stamp of approval only means that that one can venerate Black Elk even if one isn't a Lakota Catholic. One can venerate him no matter where you are. But the Lakota know who he is. But it's, for me, it's interesting just to see how that process is leading to discussion, which has always been going on about Lakota identity, and obviously the relationship between Lakota tradition and Catholicism and things like that. So it's sort of accidentally that I became interested in Black Elk, and since it's a current topic, I thought it would make a good conversation piece.
Mhm. What is the title of your presentation?
So I titled this Black Elk Speaks Again. Of course, the name of the book in 1932, Black Elk Speaks, is what people most associate with Black Elk. He actually wrote a letter, more of a statement, late in his life, a few years, I believe, before he passed away, in which he titled Black Elk Speaks Again.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't really a criticism, but it was of Neihardt, but it was more of just trying to explain that what Neihardt wrote, the Black Elk that appears in Black Elk Speaks, is only half of Black Elk. He says, a white man wrote a book about me, but only told about the first part of my life. And because at the time that Neihardt interviewed or conversed with Black Elk in the 30s, Black Elk had been a Catholic for many years, and he had become actually a missionary and a catechist. And so there's this whole kind of spiritual journey in his life that Neihardt never mentions. And so many people who have read Black Elk Speaks or know something about it, if that's their only reference point, it's as though the world ends at Wounded Knee, and there's no more Black Elk after that. And so the point of this, when he says Black Elk Speaks Again, was just to say, this is not the full story. And in this statement that he makes, it's kind of this kind of pro forma statement. He says, I'm a devout Christian and all this. But he does make some comments about his past role as a medicine man, as a Wakasta Wakan. And he says, I thought I was a pretty good medicine man. I might have even been a brave one, but now I'm better, he says. So he implies that there's been some further growth in his journey, and that, in Neihardt's book, the basic premise is that at the center of Black Elk's life was this shamanic vision that he had very early on. And the story of the book is that he ultimately tragically fails to fulfill his mission because he is unable to prevent, the incursion of the white man and the settlement and all that. The basic question, who was Black Elk? So Black Elk was an Oglala Lakota medicine man. So a bit of word about the terminology here. So there's really three terms that one uses to describe Black Elk's background. The biggest one is is the Sioux, right? So the Sioux is a political entity. It's a nation amalgamation of various Native American tribes in the Midwest, the Western United States. That political nation is divided into different linguistic groups. Lakota is one of the linguistic groups of the Sioux Nation. And within the Lakota, there are sub-tribes, as it were, and the Oglala are one of those tribes. So Black Elk was an Oglala Lakota Sioux. The Oglala, at least where they ended up, is in the area of the Black Hills in South Dakota. At the time that Black Elk came to adulthood, there was a place called Pine Ridge that had become a reservation. So that's kind of his background. He's coming from the Oglala Lakota Sioux. He was born in 1863, just at the time when there was a great deal of white settlement and encroachment on Lakota lands. There had been unsuccessful attempts by the U.S. government at that time to try to establish a treaty that would reserve land for the Lakota. Unfortunately, it led to fighting, to a war, basically, which didn't end in the Lakota's favor. But that was kind of the environment he was born into, and he actually participated in the fighting. 1876, he was at the Battle of Little Bighorn, that was Custer's last stand, which was actually the victory for the Native Americans. And later on, he was a witness to the massacre at Wounded Knee, which was, I think, in 1890. So he was very much present to the history of colonialism and the suppression of Native rights and all that. But for our purposes, the important event was when he was 9 years old, he had a vision. He went into a state of illness. And this was not something he brought on himself, but rather something that happened to him. And for a long time, he didn't discuss this vision with others, but eventually, I think when he was a teenager, he mentioned it to some other Lakota. And it was definitely recognized that this is the sort of thing that happens when someone is called to be a Wakasta Wakan, a medicine man. Now, he himself, his father and grandfather had been medicine men of his tribe, and so there was kind of a lineage there. But the peculiarities of this experience really formed the center of his story, because he saw himself as not just another healer, but someone who had been called to save his people from destruction, and indeed to bring them into a wider world, a world in which all people would somehow be united. All the hoops, as it were, of the different nations would be brought together. So he has a kind of almost an apocalyptic vision. And later on in life, he sees this as a mission that he has to fulfill. Somehow he has to do this. So anyway, he was part of this struggle that was going on with the colonizers. Interestingly, he also participated in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was kind of like this cowboys versus Indians thing. So he also kind of, as a young adult, he took on sort of the stereotype that was being foisted upon Native Americans. And actually, he traveled to England So he had an exposure to European society. He had some things to say about that. So he was in this kind of love-hate relationship with the world around him. In 1892, his first wife converted to Christianity. She became a Catholic. There was a mission at that time there. And at this time, Christian missions were very much part and parcel to the attempts to assimilate the various Native American tribes. He eventually was baptized himself. They chose to baptize all their children. So although he had this pre-Christian, as it were, this very Native vision, it didn't prevent him from deciding to identify himself in some way with the religion that was being brought into their world by the settlers. And that is sort of the crux, the paradox of his life later on. But anyway, that all happened around the turn of the century. In 1904 is when he became a Catholic. In the 1930s, so about 30 years later, he meets this guy, John Neihardt. So John Neihardt was a poet. He too, I think at the age of 11, he had an illness and a mystical experience. He was very much of a romantic bent in the sense of, desiring to find some greater meaning in the world around him. Like the American psychologist William James, he believed that the essence of religion was mystical experience. And so he was attracted to Black Elk as sort of a kindred spirit. They both had some personal transformative moment that had led them to do what they do. For him, for Neihardt, he became a poet. And his poetry examined themes that could be found in mythology. He was writing kind of an epic cycle of poems called the Cycle of the West, that is, say, the American West, when he heard about Black Elk. And eventually he sought him out and wanted to speak with him. And so they met. This was around 1930 that they met for the first time. And according to Neihardt, after he realized that that Neihardt was a sympathetic listener and sort of appreciated Lakota ways, Black Elk told him, he said, what I know was given to me in this vision was for all mankind. And he says, it is true and it is beautiful. Soon I shall be under the grass and it will be lost, but you, Neihardt, were sent to save it. So at least according to Neihardt, Black Elk saw this opportunity as a way to communicate and preserve his vision for a larger audience. And obviously a poet, writing in English could reach a larger audience than a Lakota medicine man who couldn't speak any English.
Let's talk for a moment about what that vision was.
Yeah. Yeah, so the vision, he had many visions during his lifetime, according to Black Elk Speaks, the book. The most important one was, again, this one when he was, I think, 9 years old. And in this vision, when he fell ill, in his vision, he was laid on his back in his parents' teepee. And in the vision, the top of the teepee opened to the skies. And he was told that the grandfathers were waiting for him. The grandfathers presumably being some sort of ancestral powers. And in this vision, he is taken up into what he called a cloud world, sort of this heavenly ascent, in which the 6 grandfathers gave him different instructions or different sacred objects that were to be used to maintain his people's sacred hoop. And Ron, maybe you can help out here to explain what a sacred hoop is. What does that represent in Native American culture?
Well, I actually happen to have a quote of his pulled up. It says, "And I say the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight. And in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father." So I know, like in my own personal journey, this was actually the year when Standing Rock happened. And I was actually getting ready for bed one evening, and I had this message come through, and it basically said, "You've been chosen by the Wakantanka people," and Wakantanka is like Great Spirit to them. Anything that is Wakan is kind of like spiritual in a sense. And so within 3 days of that message was when they started to gather at Standing Rock. I think this is in the latter part of 2016, I think is when that was. And so I wanted to actually go there and participate and be part of the protest. And they saw this as, for them, as being part of prophecy. There was this prophecy of the black snake, and that it was going to, I believe, ruin the land, you know, and so forth. And so they felt it was their obligation, their duty to protect this. And that's why they were doing what they're doing, is in relationship to prophecy. And so, you know, there were 3 friends, myself and 2 others, who, you know, we wanted to go on this journey out there. It had ended in December of that year. So we went the following summer. And we really didn't have a great agenda in going. I had put a few things on a Post-it note as to one was related to Chief Arvel Looking Horse, who is the keeper of the White Buffalo Calf Pipe. And so we wanted to see if we could try to see him, meet with him. So we went in the summer of, I believe, 2017. And so really we're just kind of trusting our own instincts or guidance from spirit or whatever you want to call it. We had gone up through Wisconsin and we went to Devil's Lake there. And that was really kind of interesting tie-in, because there they had mounds that were from the ancient Native people there as well, and which would be very similar to where I live in Ohio, where we have Serpent Mounds as well. So anyways, we made our way out there. On our way, we encountered some interesting things. They have a concept within the Native tradition of Thunderbird. And Thunderbird, in one story I read, was actually thought to reside at the top of what is now called Black Elk Peak. For a while it was called Harney Peak, but then it was changed to honor Black Elk. Now, this is supposed to be where Black Elk actually, I believe, he climbed to the top of this mountain, and he had one of his visions there as well. So this was also another kind of waypoint on our journey, our goal as we went there. On the way to South Dakota, we had kind of an interesting experience where we were driving across the plains, and you can see for a great distance. And off in the distance, we see this storm coming. And so, you know, at first, you know, everything is clear, but then there's this like lightning and everything like in the center of that. And then finally it gets closer to us, and we pull into this gas station, and there's just like tremendous rain and lightning and hail and everything like that. And so to me, this was a bit symbolic of the Thunderbird as well, almost like being part of our mission, because the Thunderbird was something that caused these events in nature. I've heard it described as a primordial force, you know, which it can be, you know, like storms can be healing in one sense because they cause things to grow, but they can also be destructive. So it's this force that can be neither good or evil, or both in some sense, depending upon your perspective. So at any rate, we continued on to South Dakota, and we went to, we actually took a day, and we were going to hike up to the top of Black Elk Peak. And again, we didn't take the standard route. We parked at this one trailhead, and basically it took us 5 hours to hike up, and then we were up at the peak for about an hour, and then another 5 hours back. So it was about 11-hour journey. There's a shorter route, which I think maybe takes about 3.5 hours, something like that. So, but this was kind of, this was a tie-in for us. It was maybe a bit of a spiritual pilgrimage there. When Black Elk, when he stood at this point, you can actually see 4 states in all directions. You know, it's very high, and I think it maybe was over like 8,000 feet, something like that. And so this is where he was talking about looking in all these directions, and it's basically like one big hoop, one big circle, and we're all part of that big hoop and that big circle. You know, some friends and I, we use a phrase called that part of our goal is to combine the sacred hoops. That it's not just about, you know, Christianity versus, you know, any other religion or whatever. That we all, I think mountain in some sense is a good metaphor, because you know, maybe we're all going to the same place, but we may take different paths to get there, you know, to climb this mountain in some sense. So another aspect of this journey, which was interesting, was that, again, you know, we had tried to meet with Chief Arbel. He wasn't there at the time. His brother lived next door, and so we went over there, and he wasn't at home. And so shortly thereafter, then we went into a museum nearby. I think it was in Eagle Butte, and we went into this museum, and one of them gave us a flyer for a powwow that was that weekend. And he's like, well, maybe he'll be here. So we arranged our plans. We were going to be heading back home that weekend, but we thought, well, if we all take turns driving, we can get back in time. So we're gonna go, and we're gonna make it anyways. And so we went there, and we actually did meet his brother, which was very cool. My one friend, she was meeting and talking with some of the elders there, and also met an interesting person there. His name was Red Bear, and he's one of the people who's one of the Lakota teachers. One of the things that, you know, I learned from him, and he and I are friends now on Facebook as well. And one of the things he talks about being a Lakota teacher of the language is that, you know, there's a fear of the language being lost in some sense, of losing their culture and their history. So that's a little bit of the journey there. I'll turn it back over to you and see if there's anything relevant in that you can find useful and expand upon.
Sure. Yeah, I actually just pulled up the Black Elk's prayer that I mentioned earlier on, that actually speaks to some of what you were saying there. The prayer goes like this. It says, "Grandfather, great mysterious one, you have been always, and before you nothing has been. There is nothing to pray to but you. The star nations all over the universe are yours, and yours are the grasses of the earth. Day in, day out, you are the light of things. You are older than all weeds, older than all things on earth. Grandfather, all over the earth the faces of living things are all alike. In tenderness they have come upon the ground. Look upon your children with children in their arms, that they may face the winds and walk the good road to the day of quiet. Teach me to walk the soft earth, a relative to all that is. Sweeten my heart and fill me with life. Give me the strength to understand and the eyes to see. Help me, for without you, I am nothing." And you can very much see also a lot of the terminology he uses in this poem also occurs in the vision that he describes. I wanted to say a few more things about the vision itself. As I said, you know, he has this sort of, according to Neihardt, he has this sequence of encounters with the grandfathers. And you brought up the point about seeing the whole world as one, joining all the hoops together, with the sheltering tree in the middle. The tree comes from a sacred stick, which one of the grandfathers gives to him. And it is said that this is the center of a nation Black Elk will save. In the vision, he goes on a horse. He rides into a dying village, and he revives it by planting the stick in the center of his people's hoop. And then he calls them to follow him down what he calls the red road to the good land. I don't know exactly how the red road fits into Lakota tradition. Later on, he would preserve this idea of there being two roads. There's the red road, which is the good one, the one that leads to this healing or life, and then there's the black road, which leads to death.
Mm-hmm.
In this vision, when he leads them on the red road to the good land, there are four ascents or four challenges that the people have to face, and each is more difficult than the next.
Mm-hmm.
But the goal is that at the end of the challenges, at the end of the journey, then you have all the hoops together with the tree sheltering them from the center of it. So that is the vision, or in essence, the vision, at least as it was reported by Neihardt. And what is interesting about it, beyond its connections with Lakota tradition, is that many elements of it were preserved in his practice as he progressed as a catechist and all this. So as he began to kind of adapt Christianity to his people, he preserved a lot of the terms of this vision, as well as a lot of the practices of his people, like the peace pipe, things like that, the sacred pipe. There were some things he didn't continue. He didn't continue his traditional mode of healing, possibly because he didn't think that that was his role anymore, that his role had somehow changed. But there were many elements, even of that he wanted to see preserved. And that may be one of the reasons why he asked Neihardt to just not simply tell his vision, but to tell his life story. Later on, I think this was near the end of his life, in 1947. He died in 1950. So just 3 years before he died, there was another Western scholar, Joseph Brown, who came and wanted to learn from him about the different rituals of the Oglala Sioux. And so Black Elk, again, he asked that this all be written down so that his people's beliefs and practices could be preserved and understood. And so that came out as a book called The Sacred Pipe. Finally, there was, during this whole period, late 20s into the later years of his life, he actually tried to create it would be crass to call it sort of a tourist trap, but he created a show, basically, on the reservation that he could use to demonstrate to non-Native Americans the meaning of these rites. So on the one hand, he's sort of he moves away from his role as a medicine man, or at least it expresses it in a new way as a catechist, but at the same time, he's not giving up his traditions. According to one of his daughters, he would pray with his peace pipe and his rosary every day. So he sort of combines the practices of the two traditions. Mm-hmm. So that's what makes him kind of interesting to the question of his Christianity, is what did his Christianity mean? Was it just a rejection of the old for something new? Apparently not, or at least it was much more complicated than that. A lot of people who write about Black Elk, and it's largely a puzzle, because our main written text by Neihardt says nothing about the second part of his life. His children preserve oral statements about what he said and what he did, but they don't really form an easily connectable whole. And so kind of the challenge of studying Black Elk and understanding him is trying to piece all that together. And people have tried various ways of expressing it. And some people will call it dual participation. So he continued to participate and preserve the traditions of the Lakota, mm-hmm. while embracing and, in a sense, translating this global religion into that local context. And as a student of religion, that's something that fascinates me, because that's not unique to Christianity. It's also prominent in Buddhism and Islam, is that when you have a global philosophy that comes concretely to a particular location, it's going to absorb and be changed by some of those local practices. And Black Elk is a really interesting example of that, given his particular background as a medicine man.
You know, I think, for myself, I've studied many world's religions, and also within the context of mysticism as well. And so, and for me, myself, I identify as a mystic because of my own experience. And I think for me, the spiritual journey is a very personal one, and so when you have the mystical experience, that you can actually see the divine within everything, everything to me is speaking to me and teaching to me and communicating meaning to me, you know. So I would look at him and his practice and his experience and everything, and I see him reconciling those things and being that as part of his journey. Part of that journey is inward, but part of that journey is also outward as well, you know. So, you know, he's confronted with maybe with the question of, okay, well, we have these new people who have come into our lives, and how are we going to integrate with each other? And how is this part of the greater vision, you know, that he himself had? And how do we take our combined visions, and how do we, you know, work through that? Whenever I was out there in South Dakota, I happened to see a book. We had gone to the museum for Crazy Horse, and they had a bunch of books there related to Native Americans, and one of those was called The Pipe and the Christ. And I was a little bit curious about that. I just took a picture of my camera. I was like, well, maybe later I'll get to this. So when I came back, you know, I ordered a copy and I read it, and it had to do with some members of the Catholic Church who lived in that area, and they met with some of the elders, and they compared their beliefs, and then they talked about things like you mentioned there about the Red Road, but they were drawing correlations and parallels between their belief systems and trying to find some common ground. So it's really quite a fascinating book. You know, one example of that Red Road would be something like the Sweat Lodge, you know, these practices that you go through, perhaps you'll encounter some trauma in your life. And so going into the Sweat Lodge is something that can be part of that healing process. I participated in a number of sweat lodges myself. So this has kind of been part of the expanding my own spirituality. And you know, going out there made me more curious about them. And, you know, I've even visited with the Hopi in Arizona as well. And even actually in the past in my life, I had gone to powwows before. I've always had some, you know, deep connection to Native American beliefs and spirituality and so on. So that's my own little perspective.
Yeah, and in the case of Black Elk, there needed to be reconciliation for him, because this was simply a reality he had to deal with. Since that time, and this is not just unique to the Oglala Sioux, but in many Native American communities throughout America, you find this historical phase where there's this interaction, an explicit interaction with Christianity perforce, because they have no choice but to engage it, because that's the environment they're in. And in later generations, more recent generations, the emphasis has been less to decide whether to affirm or reject the religion, but rather to recuperate the practices of the past. And this also has happened among Black Elk's children, his descendants. Some would say that, you know, the elders, many of them followed Black Elk in his choice, but others didn't. And some people have written on this, suggest that it says that you don't need to see these as two competing camps, but rather two different needs that are both being expressed. When one is in a position like Black Elk's, one needed to make a choice, not just in terms of his own personal vision, but also in terms of the good of his people. He also said this quite often. He says, I want to build a world in which my children can survive, basically, which in that case meant some sort of reconciliation with the dominant culture. Mm-hmm. But I mean, given the fact that it clearly wasn't just, you know, he was forced to do this. No, I mean, he became a missionary, you know, according to some, you know, counts, he converted over 400 Lakota to Christianity. So this was certainly something he actually believed in, not simply something that was being forced on. But at the same time, no one forced him to preserve the traditions of the sacred pipe. No one forced him to preserve all of these traditions at a time when the European missionaries were ignoring them. Right? At this time, even the Jesuits, who were the ones who ran the mission there, they stopped learning Lakota language. They weren't really interested in developing some indigenous appropriation of this. They were simply, they were the conquering culture. And so he was really pushing against that. Someone who has commented on this recently, David Martinez, who's written an interesting review on recent books on Black Elk, he was the one who says that these aren't two competing camps, Black Elk as a catechist versus Black Elk a medicine man, but his two parts of his life reflect these two needs. And the two needs, he says, are on the one hand, having to make these choices. And on the other hand, he says, in order to be Lakota, you have to connect with that source of self, he writes, that only one's family, language, homeland, and sacred history can provide. You can't accept it from some foreign source. It has to be from within. And he says, these are two sides of the same mountain, at the base of which is the collective recognition that the Lakota are indigenous to the place given them by the Creator. Along with this place came a certain way of doing things which is neither an ideology nor a theology, but the knowledge and wisdom that results from generations of experience inhabiting a given place. And this too is something that you find in any religion that claims some sort of global relevance, is it has to acknowledge the importance of place. And again, this is true of Buddhism and Islam too, where they have to somehow accommodate to the systems of symbols and meanings of the local people who identify with it. One last comment I wanted to pull out. This is interesting. This is made by an important Sioux intellectual named Vine Deloria, who died a few years back. Let me see if I can find it on my note here. Basically, Deloria suggests that Black Elk Speaks, it's important not only because it is one of the only expressions of Lakota spirituality by a Lakota who lived it, but because it is mediated, right, by a Westerner, by a white American, it enabled it to reach a greater audience than Black Elk could ever have done on his own. And Deloria suggests that because of this, this has entered the canon, as he puts it, of the Lakota intellectual tradition, but also the canon of American literature. More non-Native Americans have read Black Elk Speaks than probably any other autobiography of a Native American, or at least that it certainly became important during the 60s and the 70s when there was this, again, revival of indigenous identity. It went into paperback reprint then, it became a bestseller. So ironically, people who are looking for some pristine, unmediated access to a way of life that existed at that time, it only comes through the mediation of this, this mystic poet from Illinois, Neihardt. So in a sense, Black Elk Speaks expresses this joining of all the different hoops together, because you had to have a Westerner and a Lakota together to do it.
I wanted to bring up another version I had of whenever we did the Standing Rock training presentation. The quote I have here is, "And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in a sacred manner the shape of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and starlight. And in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father. And I saw that it was holy." You have anything further you want to add or talk about, or?
Yeah, I could just add a piece about the canonization process that's going on right now. One of the reasons why that's worth paying attention to is that even if it doesn't proceed all the way to him being recognized as a saint, the fact that he has already been recognized as what's called a servant of God, or basically a person who has excelled in the virtues, something he talks about a lot in his own catechesis. The fact that this would be the second Native American who would be recognized by a global religion of having this status would be significant, not just for the Lakota, but also for the whole model of interaction that Black Elk represents, of, you know, as you were saying, of successfully reconciling different peoples and their traditions. And the very fact that the process has gone this far probably indicates that a lot of people recognize that this is important for the survival of the human race. In other words, you saint people who you recognize are doing something that is vital. And so the very fact that this process is underway for the past few years, I think, is a signal that a lot of people, not just the Lakota who asked for it, but also for the, you know, American bishops who are vouching for it and all that, that there's a recognition that what Black Elk was attempting to do is the way forward, you know, for any number of issues in the world today. And so, although, you know, the process itself, you know, getting a rubber stamp of approval from some religious organization, that's neither here nor there. But the fact that it's happening at all suggests that there's something important that Black Elk represented. And like you were saying, you know, that with the Standing Rock, you know, that too brings in the whole vision of Black Elk. It becomes relevant again for this new crisis that we face. So that's my reflection. That's where I am right now thinking about all this.
So, I mean, and that's an example of how a vision, you know, one could have a vision, but it could take much longer than their own individual lifetime for it to be realized.
Yes.
Couple other questions as well. So you're talking about kind of like two phases in his life, you know, the Lakota phase, and then his conversion to Catholicism, or integration, maybe is a better term, with Catholicism. And did he have any experiences in the second portion, you know, that would be spiritual in nature? Did that continue on for him? How did that relate?
Yeah, it's difficult to discern that because, again, most of the verbiage we get, most of the written letters that he wrote at the time, they were largely in more of this kind of public discourse of, you know, teaching people the faith and things like that. It didn't really penetrate, at least from what I've read, some of the depths that he touches in his earlier visions. I don't know whether that means he didn't have any other visions. It may be that he experienced it in a different context, or maybe Neihardt was right. Maybe that vision when he was 9 of the hoops in the tree, maybe that's all he needed. Maybe he didn't need any further visionary prompts in order to pursue the path he was pursuing. That, you know, more may come to light. I mean, I know that there's actually a lot of stuff that's been recorded by his family members. Most of them, though, they talk more in terms of his practice. You know, they wouldn't talk about, you know, any private visions he might have had. So unfortunately, we just don't know, because we didn't have a Neihardt write the second part of his life.
Right.
But so we have fragments. We have fragments that, in a sense, they challenge us to imagine, you know, what this might look like. Not necessarily for him, but, you know, how we might try to implement that vision, whether it's at Standing Rock or someplace else. So in a sense, what Black Elk Speaks has left us is a model maybe to follow, at least the model of another person's journey to be inspired by. And I think what I'd want to end on is, I think it's really important to at least be aware of that second half of his life, which he thought was very important, at least in his own statements, and his family did. Because, again, if we only go with Black Elk Speaks, Neihardt presents that as a tragedy that was never realized. But we know for a fact that he continued to be upbeat about this. He thought that he was continuing to pursue that vision
Mhm.
to his dying day. And so you can take what is valuable. I mean, because Black Elk Speak is valuable not only in telling his story, but also it's a critique of Neihart's critique of Western culture as it is destroying indigenous cultures.
Mhm.
So I mean, there's that, but then there's this other side. So Black Elk might have said, well, you know, it wasn't a failure. It's going on. It's continuing. So at least to be aware of that second part of his life is important when one reads Black Elk Speaks.
I drew some inspiration from Black Elk myself because, as I understand it, he was actually reluctant to talk about his vision and his experience at first. And I think there might have even been, you and I have both kind of had the discussion in relationship to shamanism as well. It's a very common experience to experience something like this, death and rebirth, or something that there's another concept called the wounded healer, that some of us talk about, that you have this experience where you get sick and you actually have to come to terms with what your calling is, and you actually have to not engage in self-doubt, that you have to communicate what it is that has been communicated to you and not be afraid to share that message. I'm a little curious about when he was in the missionary phase of his life. Did he incorporate in his teachings, did he draw upon things from his Lakota path and communicate those to other people as well? Do you know?
To some degree, yes. Well, the one example that I gave already was the two roads, right? The Black Road and the Red Road. I mean, from a Christian perspective, Jesus talks about there are two roads, right? The narrow way and the easy way. But this is a good example because, if you look at what he taught, the content of what he taught was intelligible within the framework of Jesus's teaching that he, imbibed from the Jesuits, as well as the color symbolism of the black and the red from his vision. So maybe that, I mean, these are little pieces, but if we appreciate both sides of that, we can see how there was a continuum between the vision and the later narrative that he identifies with. So it wasn't like a break. It wasn't like, I gave up my old ways and now I have a new way. No, it's the same narrative for him. And he adapts it in various ways to communicate so that those children whom he raised within the Christian faith would be hearing it in a Lakota key, as it were. And then if they ever encountered, in these other rituals, which he also tried to preserve, that language, they would say, aha, that's nothing different than what Black Elk taught us.
Mm-hmm. You can tell me if I'm going out on a limb here, but within Christianity, there would be the idea of the sacrificial blood that was shed, and that was red. So is there some correlation there between the red road and this, the idea of sacrifice, at least?
I don't know about the symbolism of the color, but sacrifice is interesting because one person who is I think himself a Lakota, who's kind of trying to make sense of Black Elk, he said Black Elk's conversion was a sacrifice for his people. And I don't think he meant that in kind of a cynical way that he just did this because that would give them a better economic standing in the society. No, I think when he saw this as a sacrifice, at the center of Christianity is a narrative of sacrifice. And I think that if that's a valid interpretation of his choice, he's identifying with Jesus there as the healer, right? Because Jesus was a healer too, and
right.
Healer himself, he probably saw an affinity between himself and that whole idea. So I don't think it's going out on a limb. I think that it makes a lot of sense from his perspective coming into that. Of course, what he does is he brings to that sense of healing and sacrifice something maybe quite different and more profoundly local than the Jesuit missionaries could possibly have done because they didn't know that tradition. He could tie it in with the vision of the grandfathers. This isn't, so for him, this wasn't a foreign religion. There may be foreigners, telling us that, but no, this is not a foreign religion. This is the tree. This is the tree and the vision that binds us all together with these hoops. So I think that I can imagine, I mean, the piece, I've read some of his pastoral letters that he wrote, and he does talk about sacrifice, dying to self. He doesn't express it in profoundly mystical language because he's talking to ordinary people. This is the thing, is that if one wants to find a kind of mysticism within Black Elk's role as a catechist and missionary, one won't find it because he's not talking to mystics. He's talking to ordinary people who don't have a lot of education, but who he needs to keep this language. He needs to keep this language and this tradition going. So in a sense, for us intellectuals, like, we want more, but we won't hear it in those words. But if we understand the context in which he's saying those words, this is the way he's holding the hoop together.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think my last question would be, do you have any thoughts on what do you think his chances are of being canonized?
I suspect they're very good. The reason why is because since his death, and he died in 1950, 1965 was the Second Vatican Council, which made official a shift towards a much more positive, inclusive view of the relationship of Christianity to other traditions. And out of that comes this idea of what Christian theologians call inculturation, which is related to the term incarnation, right? So at the center of Christianity is this idea that God becomes human, that God becomes incarnate. So that's a central Christian doctrine. As people reflected on the way in which Christianity spread and interacted with other cultures, they say, well, it's not just a bunch of abstract ideas being foisted upon different cultures, although unfortunately it often has been made into that, but rather true evangelization is what is called inculturation. The person and message of Jesus are inculturated, that they enter into relationship with an existing tradition and culture. I think Black Elk's vision of the sacred tree with all the hoops around it, that's the Christian idea of enculturation. It could also be interpreted from a Lakota standpoint too, but I think that there's something within Catholic thinking of the last half century that would recognize that immediately and say, yes, this is exactly what we're talking about. Here's a real example of it. And as people obviously become more sensitive to the ways in which evangelization has been connected and in bed with colonialism and imperialism and all those bad things, a model like what Black Elk was doing, I think people see this as intrinsically necessary to avoid distorting religion. So I suspect the chances are good, although I believe that there has to be some miracles involved. And this is kind of interesting too, because everyone is supposed to be a saint. Everyone is a saint in potential within the Christian understanding. The reason why it's hard to be canonized is because there's actually a bit of intellectual humility. We don't know what happened to that person. We don't know if they finished their journey. That's only something they know and God knows. Mm-hmm. So unless we have concrete evidence that they are engaging, that they're interceding for us, that they're doing things for us, after death, then there's really then it's just, if someone says that person's a saint, it's just that person's opinion. So it's a really interesting process of finding objective evidence that someone is functioning as a saint. But that's only for the folks who are kind of umpiring the thing. Everyone at Pine Ridge knows that he's a saint. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows who he was and what he represented, so they don't need the Vatican to tell them he's a saint. But it would be a nice recognition of the global significance of that vision, I think.
And I know that more recent popes have made efforts to kind of build bridges with the Native American community, correct? I believe that's actually at times been controversial as well, has it not?
Probably. I mean, I would imagine that probably all three of the last popes, John, Paul, Benedict, and especially Francis, have been very much attentive to that for different reasons. Um, and occasionally a pope can say, "I think we should canonize this person." But what's really interesting about the canonization process is 99% of the time, it's the local community that says there needs to be a universal recognition of this person that we already know functioned this way for us. So it's, in a sense, the canonization process, it's not a top-down thing. It involves various layers of the universal church, but it begins at Pine Ridge, and it begins with his family. It begins with the people who have been affected by him. So in a sense, it's being guided by the realities on the ground. And I think especially Pope Francis realizes the importance of the realities on the ground, and how people actually hear things, and what it means to them. So I suspect that trend will continue, because for it not to continue would be catastrophic. I mean, it would just be continuing all the bad practices that have been damaging people and cultures, with the unfortunate alliance between religion and power.
I guess one final question. In this journey that you've taken into investigating Black Elk, what meaning has that brought to you? And also, do you see out of this some vision for all of us going forward?
I had never actually, until I started looking at this over the last 3 months, I had never actually thought about his vision very carefully. I kind of knew about it, but now that I understand the different elements of it and the narrative that it was part of, this visionary narrative, it ties in with a lot of other spiritual journeys that I've read about. I'm not sure I would identify it with my own journey, but I mean, it's the hero with 1,000 faces. I think Campbell talked about Black Elk Speaks. Jung put a footnote in one of his books about it because he recognized that there's something universal about this, and yet it's not universal in the abstract. Every element of it is specific to this piece of land, to this culture, to this language. So I find it inspiring just in the way that it is able to communicate a global vision from a particular viewpoint. One doesn't need to give up being a Lakota and sort of acquire some cosmopolitan worldview in order to have this, right? That you can be one hoop and still recognize that you're part of this larger whole. There's no tension between the sacred stick that he puts in the ground and the hoop of his own people. He doesn't identify his own people with the sacred stick, right? There is some larger thing out there, some larger reality that we're all connected to. I think that's a great way of expressing it.
I mean, really, I mean, that seems like a lesson for all of us. What's the saying about, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere? Is that the correct quote? So, yeah. Anything further? Or?
That's as far. I mean, I had a great fun time learning all this over the past couple of months, getting ready for it. I'm looking forward to reading more on it and learning more about Native American spirituality. I'm very much a neophyte in this, and so reading more and learning more is what I'm interested in doing now.
All right, sounds good. Well, appreciate your time, Chris. Thank you for taking the time to put all this together and to share your insights.
Okay, take care.
Take care, you too.
This has been a presentation of Merging Hearts Spiritual TV. Please consider donating to Merging Hearts Spiritual Center, which supports Merging Hearts Spiritual TV and allows us to bring you this excellent content.